My name is Madison Carter. I'm 28 years old, and as I pulled off the freeway into Silverfield, Oregon, I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. After 5 years of silence, I was returning to the house where everything had stayed the same, except me. In the back of my car, tucked beneath my travel bag, was a pressed uniform bearing the Silver Eagle insignia of a full colonel. My family never believed my military career was real. They called it a detour, a phase. Tomorrow, they'll find out. I parked in the same driveway I used to shovel snow from every winter, took a long breath, and stepped out. Before I share the rest, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. The moment I stepped through the front door of my childhood home in Silverfield, Oregon, it was as if time had folded in on itself. The same faded family portraits lined the hallway, each frame a quiet witness to years of comparison. The carpet still bore the slight dip where my father's shoes always landed after work, and the living room furniture sagged in familiar places, untouched by trend or change. Even the scent was the same, a blend of lavender cleaner, old upholstery, and something too stubborn to name. It was all exactly as I remembered, and somehow, that made it worse. Madison, you made it. My mother called from the kitchen, her voice floating around the corner without movement. No footsteps to greet me, no arms reaching for a hug, just words, distant and composed, like a voicemail message she had recorded in 2006 and never felt the need to update. I set my bag down beside the hall bench and ran my hand along the edge of the banister, the same one I used to cling to as a child, hoping one day I'd be seen the way Ethan always was. Ethan, my older brother, the golden boy, the one whose name had its own gravitational pull in this house. He'd be arriving soon. I'd been told more than once. Promoted again, senior project manager now. The kind of job title that made my mother's voice rise with pride and my father's chest puff slightly. The kind of success they understood, approved of, had always imagined it for myself, until I veered off script. I walked past the kitchen door where my mother stood slicing carrots, chatting aimlessly about Ethan and Olivia's new home, their corporate bonuses, the ski trip they were planning for February. She didn't ask what I'd been up to, didn't pause to wonder where I'd flown in from or how long I was staying. I nodded, made polite sounds, and excused myself upstairs. My old bedroom was frozen in time. The floral wallpaper hadn't peeled. My high school trophies still gleamed under a thin layer of dust, and the closet held the same dresses from a decade ago. It was a shrine to who they thought I was supposed to become, a reminder of the pivot they never forgave me for taking. I placed my suitcase on the bed and unzipped it slowly, revealing a black garment bag. Inside was the uniform they'd never displayed, never mentioned, never acknowledged. Midnight blue, pressed to perfection, adorned with ribbons and honors earned in places they'd never asked about. I reached inside and traced the Silver Eagle insignia on the collar. Colonel Madison Carter, 28 years old, military liaison for a $1.2 billion defense contract, the youngest colonel in my division's history. Not that they would know, not yet. I hung the uniform carefully in the back of the closet, behind my old prom dress and a cheerleading sweatshirt from senior year. They still saw me through that lens. The girl who had potential, the one who threw it away. I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the faint clatter of dinner preparation downstairs. Tomorrow, they'd attend a corporate event at Pinnacle Defense Systems, unaware that I would be walking into the same building from a different entrance. Not as their daughter, but as the one person in that room with final authority over the project. That could change their futures. Dinner was served at precisely 6:30 p.m., as it always had been. My mother Lorraine believed that punctuality and presentation were the cornerstones of a respectable household, and tonight was no exception. The dining room looked exactly as I remembered. ivory tablecloth, dimmed chandelier, and a floral centerpiece too large to see across. The dishes were her special occasion set bone china with a faint silver rim. It was the same set she had used the night I told them I was accepting my RODC scholarship. I remember. Because I had dropped my fork when my father called the military a backup plan for people with no options. The doorbell rang just as I finished helping carry water glasses to the table. "That'll be Ethan," my mother said, her smile blooming as she peeled off her apron. There was no hesitation in her steps this time. She practically floated to the door. Moments later, the familiar sound of my brother's voice filled the hallway. "Hey, Mom, brought something for dinner." "Oh, Ethan." She laughed. "You didn't have to do that." Ethan entered with Olivia at his side, both dressed in sleek business casual, tailored, expensive, coordinated. He carried a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my monthly utilities. My mother took it like it was an offering to royalty. "This will go perfectly with the roast," she beamed. "You're always so thoughtful." "Just trying to keep up with Olivia," Ethan said, turning to kiss his wife's temple. "She got promoted again last week, lead counsel now." "Really?" my mother gasped. "Oh, Olivia, that's wonderful. We must toast to that." I greeted them both with a polite smile and a quiet, "Good to see you," then slipped into my seat at the far end of the table. My father Harold came down a few minutes later, still in his work slacks and dress shirt, sleeves rolled up. He gave Ethan a firm clap on the back. "Heard about your new title," he said proudly. "Senior Project Manager, Claire Montgomery. Doesn't hand that out lightly." "She said I bring a fresh perspective," Ethan replied, sliding into his seat like a man who knew the weight of his presence. "Same project you've been on for years." "Right. Dad." "That's right." Harold nodded. "But they'll move a lot faster with someone like Ethan at the helm." I focused on passing the breadbasket. Conversation flowed easily for them. Promotions, bonuses, upcoming leadership retreats in Aspen. Olivia's law firm had secured a new tech client, and Ethan's team was now overseeing 12 direct reports, including engineers twice his age. My mother soaked it all in like gospel. "Isn't it amazing?" "Madison," she said, finally turning toward me. "Ethan's managing a whole team now." I nodded. "That's impressive." She gave a tight smile, then added, "And how's your job going? Still at the same level? Or—" the word hung in the air like a misplaced utensil. "Job. Not a career, not work. Just a job. Something you pass the time with while waiting for real life to begin." "Things are going well," I answered evenly, careful not to reveal anything. I'd learned long ago that the more I told them, the more ammunition they had to minimize it. "You're still a captain or something like that, right?" my father asked, barely glancing up from his phone. "Something like that." I took a sip of water, letting the question die. "Oh, Rachel Dunn just bought a condo downtown," my mother offered as a sudden change in direction. 3 bedrooms, beautiful view of the river. I told her she was so smart to invest young. "That's great," I said softly, though my voice was lost beneath the next round of praise for Ethan's quick rise through the ranks. There was no mention of my recent deployment, no curiosity about the uniform hanging upstairs, or the security protocol I'd helped redesign for NATO. No one asked what I'd flown home for, why I was in town, or what was happening at Pinnacle tomorrow. As we moved into dessert, homemade apple tart, Ethan's favorite, my father finally addressed me again. "CEO's coming tomorrow. Claire Montgomery. Big day for the whole branch. She's reviewing the military contract. Some colonel's supposed to attend." "Actually," he chuckled, "doubt they'll send anyone too important. Probably just someone there to nod along." Ethan leaned back, casual and smug. "Yeah, military types don't really get the business side. They just show up, check boxes, follow orders." My mother nodded without hesitation. We always said you were so bright, Madison. That's why it was hard watching you throw it away. What exactly do you think I do? I asked. Voice steady, tone neutral. Paperwork, right? Harold offered vaguely. Coordination, protocol, important stuff. But, you know, not exactly leadership material. I didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't correct. I'd had that conversation a dozen times in my head. I no longer needed to win it. Anyway, Olivia jumped in, mercifully shifting the tone. This roast is amazing. Lorraine, my mother beamed. Thank you, dear. I thought it turned out well. They kept talking about vacation plans, real estate, and office politics. I kept listening, but I stopped hoping, because tomorrow they would see, and no one at this table would be able to unsee it. That night, I lay in my old bed beneath a ceiling still speckled with glow-in-the-dark stars, relics from a version of myself long erased from family memory. The hum of the central air, the creak of the hallway floorboards, even the faint sound of my parents' voices down the hall. It was all too familiar. And yet, I felt like a stranger occupying someone else's ghost. Their laughter echoed faintly through the walls. My name wasn't mentioned, just Ethan, his new title, his prospects, how proud they were of his poise in tomorrow's presentation. I closed my eyes and felt the old ache creep in, that same tired ache I thought I'd outgrown. But memory has its own gravity, and tonight, it pulled me back. I was 19 when I made the decision, sophomore year at Ashwood University. I'd been sitting at this same dinner table, brochure in hand, trying to explain the Reserve Officer Development Corps program. It would cover tuition. It would give me structure, purpose, a career that mattered. The military, my father said. Forehead pinched like I'd just declared bankruptcy. Madison, that's not for someone like you. That's for kids who don't have options. It is an option, I had replied, heart pounding, one I've thought through. My mother looked more confused than angry. But you always said you wanted to go into business. We thought you'd intern at Pinnacle, maybe go to law school. No, I had never said that. They had. I'd merely nodded along, trying to be agreeable, trying to be the daughter who didn't make waves. But when I finally chose something for myself, the ground shifted beneath us. After that night, the tone of every conversation changed. They stopped asking about my classes, stopped mentioning future plans unless it involved Ethan. When I earned my commission 2 years later, only my cousin Rachel made the drive to attend the ceremony. My parents sent flowers. No note, no call. Meanwhile, Ethan was being ushered into Pinnacle's internship pipeline, mentored by Dad's colleagues, handed opportunities like they were family heirlooms. His first title was assistant analyst, then junior project lead. He moved through the system with a confidence built on approval. At every milestone, there was a party, a cake, and framed certificates on the wall. When I became a first lieutenant, no one in the house even acknowledged the email I sent with the news. I stopped sending them after that. But while Ethan was learning to manage spreadsheets and executive summaries, I was learning how to lead. My early assignments were grueling. Training rotations, late-night drills, language immersion, and systems analysis under pressure. I learned to think in layers, anticipate threats before they appear, recognize patterns that others missed. I wasn't just surviving, I was becoming something sharp, deliberate, dangerous in the way only clarity can be. By 23, I was promoted to captain. By 26, major. I had led cyber defense operations that prevented the breach of entire intelligence networks, cases that never made the news because the system never failed. I worked with teams twice my age, briefed generals, and when the Pentagon formed a task force for adaptive cyber infrastructure, I was their first call. Not once did my parents ask where I was stationed. Not once did they ask what I did. I stopped trying to translate my world into theirs. They had a narrative for who I was supposed to be. And when I chose something else, something they didn't understand, they decided I was lost, a deviation, an afterthought. Meanwhile, Ethan fit perfectly into their vision clean, predictable, profitable. He played the game they taught him to love, and I was the reminded that not everyone wants to win the same game. But I hadn't chosen my path out of spite. I chose it because I wanted to matter in a way that wasn't decorative, because I believed service didn't mean surrender, because I knew I had something worth offering, even if they didn't. I turned over in bed, eyes open, staring at the faint glow of plastic constellations. When I was little, I used to trace those stars with my finger, pretending they spelled out a name someone would remember. Not just Madison, the daughter. Not just Madison, but the second place. But Madison Carter, someone who had carved her own orbit. And tomorrow, they'd finally see it. Whether they were ready or not. Sleep didn't come easily that night. My mind kept drifting. Through time, through ranks, through the long, silent road I'd walked alone. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, because there was never anyone listening. I thought about the first time I stepped onto a military base, 18 years old, fresh out of high school. I still remember the weight of the RODC packet in my hands and the way the recruiter had looked at me, not like a girl with something to prove, but like someone with something to offer. That alone felt revolutionary. Back then, I couldn't have imagined where it would lead. But I knew what I was stepping away from. A world that measured worth by GPAs, internships, and the proximity to someone else's definition of success. Training was brutal in the best way. It scraped off everything artificial, every scripted answer, every polished performance I'd learned to use around my parents. It replaced those things with reflexes, instincts, strategy. I thrived in that environment. Not because I was the strongest or the fastest, but because I saw the gaps, patterns in logistics, weaknesses in systems, inconsistencies in data flow that others overlooked. My mind was wired for complexity. I just hadn't been in the right arena before. By the time I was 23, I was promoted to captain. I had already led my first deployment, managing encrypted communications for joint cyber defense units overseas. 2 years later, I was tapped for a classified project aimed at preemptive threat mapping. Our job was to anticipate cyber attacks before they ever reached American soil. And we did. Repeatedly. Quietly. With no press releases. No framed awards. Just success measured by what never made the headlines. My rise was steady. Uninterrupted. Undeniable. Promotions came early. Not because I asked, but because I delivered. I was recognized not for being loud, but for being right. I was 30 steps ahead when everyone else was still trying to find the map. I didn't need a spotlight. I just needed a mission. And then came the call from Brigadier General Dana Holloway. I still remember the sound of her voice. Firm, clipped, focused. We need someone who can navigate both languages, military and corporate, tech and tactics. You're that someone. The Pentagon had finalized a $1.2 billion defense contract with Pinnacle Systems, the same company where my father had spent nearly 3 decades and where Ethan was now climbing his way into leadership. Project Aegis, a complete overhaul of the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure across military branches. They needed a liaison, someone who could manage oversight, approve technical specifications, coordinate between Defense Command and private engineers, someone who understood how to move through brass hallways and boardrooms without blinking. I didn't hesitate. I accepted the role. 6 months ago, I was promoted to full colonel, the youngest in my division's history. The ceremony was held in a high-security wing of the Pentagon. General Holloway pinned the Silver Eagle to my collar while colleagues from 4 branches stood and applauded. There were no parents in the audience. No one from Silverfield. I hadn't invited them. Not because I was bitter, but because I knew they wouldn't come. They never had. I didn't need them to see it then. But now, with Project Aegis entering its critical phase, and with Pinnacle's CEO expecting the military liaison to appear in person, I realized something had shifted. Tomorrow, I wouldn't be walking into that building as someone they could dismiss or ignore. I wouldn't be the awkward daughter at the dinner table, or the afterthought in the family photo. I would walk in as Colonel Madison Carter, Pentagon Authority, Oversight Officer, the woman with final sign-off on the most important defense contract in my father's 30-year career. They had no idea who I'd become, but they were about to. ChatGPT deny. By the time the first sliver of morning light touched the curtains, I was already awake, hair pinned, uniform pressed, boots shined to inspection standard. There was something reverent about the ritual, the precision of it, the quiet authority sewn into every stitch of fabric. I stood in front of the mirror, fastening each button with deliberate care. This wasn't just attire, it was a declaration. And today, it would speak before I ever opened my mouth. The silver eagle glinted against the navy fabric as I pinned it to my collar. Colonel Madison Carter. I whispered the name silently, not out of pride, but as a reminder, a grounding. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. This was about doing my job, with clarity, with conviction, and without apology. Downstairs, I could hear my parents moving through their usual morning rhythm, coffee cups clinking, my mother's footsteps across the tile, Ethan's voice, cheerful and confident, discussing his presentation strategy for the day. They were preparing for something important, but they had no idea I was too. I waited until their cars pulled out of the driveway. First my father's, then Ethan's, both headed toward the Pinnacle campus in North Silverfield. I gave them a 10-minute lead. Enough time to ensure we wouldn't cross paths in the parking lot. Then I stepped outside, the chill of the Oregon air crisp against my face. My breath came out steady, controlled, the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you've done the work. The drive to Pinnacle Defense Systems took less than 15 minutes. I had memorized every detail of the building's layout, security protocols, project flowcharts, personnel profiles. I knew the names of every division lead and the specifications of every subsystem scheduled for review. This wasn't a courtesy visit, it was an operational assessment, and I held full authority over it. Budget decisions, staffing approvals, technical compliance. Every single item required my sign-off. As I pulled into the reserved parking space marked Military Liaison, the weight of the title settled into my spine, not as a burden, but as a presence, a right I had earned. Far more natural on my shoulders than the weight of unmet family expectations ever had been. Security at the gate was tight. 2 guards in navy windbreakers straightened when they saw the uniform. "Good morning, Colonel," one of them said, eyes immediately landing on my insignia. "May I see your credentials?" I handed over my military ID and Pentagon clearance with steady hands. "Colonel Madison Carter, liaison for Project Aegis." He nodded sharply. "You're expected in Conference Room Alpha. Do you require escort? No. Thank you," I replied. "I know the way." And I did. I had walked this path on blueprints and in briefings for months, but today would be the first time I walked it in person, under their roof, in their world, but not on their terms. As I crossed the lobby floor, employees glanced up from their desks and conversations, doing subtle double takes. Young female colonels weren't exactly a daily occurrence. I passed a row of promotional banners touting Pinnacle's latest achievements. One of them bore the logo of Project Aegis, clean, modern, innocuous to the untrained eye. But I knew what it meant. I knew what was at stake. I reached the elevator and pressed the button for the executive floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime. As they closed behind me, I caught my own reflection in the mirrored panel. Straight back, forward gaze, not a single tremor in my stance. I looked like command, because I was. They'd spent years underestimating me, laughing at my choices, ignoring the rank, the responsibility, the record. But today, they wouldn't see a daughter or a sister or a girl who walked away from law school brochures. Today, they'd see the one person in that building with the power to say yes or no. And this time, the entire room would be listening. The elevator doors opened with a quiet hush, revealing the executive floor's polished tile and low conversation. I stepped out into the corridor, my boots clicking with a deliberate rhythm, confident, composed, unmistakably military. Heads turned. Subtle glances became stares. I kept walking. Conference room Alpha was 3 doors down, just past the west-facing windows that overlooked the sprawling Pinnacle campus. I didn't slow my pace. I didn't need to. I knew where I was going. I had spent months preparing for this day. What I hadn't expected, what not even the most detailed logistics file could predict, was that my brother would be standing there, just outside the meeting room, reviewing notes on his tablet. Ethan looked up casually, probably expecting to greet a mid-level contractor or an early-arriving analyst. His eyes met mine, and then dropped to the silver eagle on my collar. He froze. The color drained from his face so quickly, I wondered if he might actually faint. The tablet lowered slowly. "Madison," he asked, but the question barely formed. "What?" "Why are you—" "Good morning, Mr. Carter," I said, keeping my voice calm, professional. "I'm here for the Aegis Project review." Before he could speak again, another figure emerged from the hallway behind him. My father, Harold, deep in conversation with 2 colleagues from operations. He didn't notice me at first, not until he reached Ethan's side and followed his stunned gaze to where I stood. He stopped mid-sentence. The pause stretched, thick with disbelief. "Madison," he said slowly, eyes moving from my face to the ribbons on my uniform, down to the insignia on my shoulders. "What? What's going on? Why are you—" "In uniform," I offered gently. "I'm here in my official capacity." I nodded toward the glass doors of the conference room. "We're scheduled to begin in 20 minutes. The 2 executives beside him, one I recognized from project files as Marcus Langford, VP of Engineering, were already staring. Their gazes moved between my father and me, putting the pieces together. "Colonel," Marcus said carefully, stepping forward, "we weren't told you'd be attending in person today. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you." "Mr. Langford," I replied with a slight incline of my head. I thought a direct presence would be more efficient for the scope of today's reviews. Behind me, a passing admin assistant nearly dropped a folder as she caught sight of my uniform. Her eyes widened before she quickly turned away, whispering to someone by the copier. The ripple had begun. Harold tried to recover, straightening his posture, adjusting his tone. "You didn't mention this at dinner," he said, as if my arrival were a casual breach of etiquette. "We had no idea you were—" His voice faltered again. He couldn't finish the sentence. "Colonel Pentagon liaison guest of the CEO. You'll find everything clarified during the meeting," I said calmly. "Claire Montgomery will be providing context for my role. I'll let her speak to that." I offered a polite, practiced smile. "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to review some briefing documents before we begin." I turned and walked toward the conference room, the whispers rising behind me like a soft current. I didn't need to look back to know my father was still standing there, stunned. Ethan, too, his jaw tight, his confidence from last night reduced to confused silence. For years, they'd spoken about my work like it was a footnote, a side gig, a fallback. Now they were watching me walk into a room where I didn't need their recognition. because I'd already earned everyone else's. And for the first time in this building, it wasn't Ethan who was being asked about. It was me. The conference room was already humming with quiet anticipation when I entered. A long, polished table stretched across the center, surrounded by executives reviewing slides, pouring coffee, or whispering final adjustments to their teams. At the head of the room, a large display screen projected the Pinnacle Systems logo and the words, "Project Aegis Secure Tomorrow." I walked to my seat, clearly marked for military liaison, and placed my briefing folder in front of me. A few heads turned as I settled in. Others tried not to stare. The brass on my uniform didn't exactly blend in with navy suits and branded blouses. I caught the eye of Marcus Langford, who offered a respectful nod. A woman from legal whispered something to her colleague and then typed rapidly into her phone. I didn't need to guess what the message said. Word was spreading fast. Harold and Ethan entered a few minutes later, noticeably quieter than when I had last seen them. They took seats 2/3 down the table, avoiding eye contact. My mother used to say that silence before a storm was God's way of offering mercy, but I didn't feel merciful today. I felt ready. At precisely 900 m, the door opened. Claire Montgomery stepped in, composed and commanding in a tailored black dress. She scanned the room, and when her gaze landed on me, it changed everything. "Well, this is a surprise," she said, her expression shifting into a smile. "Colonel Carter, I thought we were scheduled for a video briefing." I stood. "I happened to be in town visiting family," I replied evenly. "I thought it might be more efficient to conduct the review in person." Claire extended her hand across the table. "Your initiative is appreciated. It's an honor to have you here." Then she turned to the room, her voice carrying clarity and authority. "For those who may not be aware, Colonel Madison Carter is the Pentagon's primary liaison for Project Aegis. She will be overseeing technical compliance, performance milestones, and implementation strategy. She holds final approval on all major decisions." I didn't need to look. I could feel it. Ethan's breath catching, Harold shifting in his seat. The air changed, the hierarchy realigned, and no one could pretend not to notice. Claire opened the meeting with progress updates, handing the floor to project leads in turn. Most addressed me directly, recognizing my authority without hesitation. When technical questions arose, about encryption layers, adaptive firewalls, or system redundancy, I responded with precise, measured insight. My answers weren't dramatic. They were correct. And in this room, that meant everything. Then came Ethan's turn. He stood, walked to the front, and launched into his presentation with the polish of someone used to being the smartest voice in the room. For a few minutes, he held their attention, discussing user interface enhancements, streamlining operations, optimizing workflows. But when he touched on cross-system integrations, I raised a hand slightly. "Mr. Carter," I said, "can you clarify how your proposed dashboard design accounts for concurrent threat assessments across isolated network segments?" He paused. Well, the goal is to have real-time updates." "Understood," I said gently. "But how are you isolating the Aegis modules from legacy system interference?" A flicker of hesitation crossed his face. "We're still evaluating compatibility protocols." I nodded once. "You'll need to finalize those before this phase proceeds. Integration failure at that level could compromise encryption stability across all branches." He looked down. "Yes, ma'am." A few seats away, Harold's jaw clenched. I asked 2 more questions. Technical, targeted, necessary. Not to embarrass him, but because that's what my job required. Claire didn't flinch. The board didn't either. They listened. They took notes. And when Ethan sat down again, he wasn't the center of gravity anymore. 3 hours later, the meeting adjourned. Claire stood once more. Colonel Carter will remain on site through tomorrow to conduct security audits and personnel evaluations. Please provide her with full cooperation. Project Aegis is a matter of national defense, and we're fortunate to have her expertise guiding it. As the room emptied, no one rushed to Harold or Ethan. They came to me, executives, engineers, compliance officers, all with questions, with updates, with requests for review. One by one, they shook my hand, called me Colonel, asked for guidance. My name had finally arrived in the room long before I ever opened my mouth. And for the first time, it wasn't a surprise. It was recognition. ChatGPT'd and I. After the meeting adjourned, the air in the conference room shifted from structured professionalism to hushed awe. Conversations buzzed softly in corners, not with gossip, but with the careful language of recalibration. People were connecting dots, reassessing assumptions. Names were being remembered differently now. Claire Montgomery remained near the head of the table, speaking with her executive team. She motioned toward me. "Colonel Carter," she said warmly, "if you have a moment, I'd like to formally introduce you to some of our senior leadership. I believe a few of you may know her by reputation already, but it's time to connect the face with the work." I stepped forward, shoulders square, voice steady. This was familiar ground. Command briefings, diplomatic introductions, policy negotiation. But what made it different today was the presence of my father, still standing slightly apart, his expression unreadable. Claire began with Marcus Langford. "Marcus is our VP of Engineering. He's been following your framework on quantum threat countermeasures very closely." Marcus offered a firm handshake. "Colonel, your white paper on adaptive encryption practically rewrote our internal protocol. It's already in use." "Glad to hear it," I replied. "Theory is only as good as its implementation." Then came Rachel Stanton from Corporate Compliance and Thomas Elridge from Advanced Systems, both shaking my hand with a level of deference that couldn't be mistaken for politeness. Claire continued around the room until she reached my father. "And of course," she said, turning with ease, "you must know Harold Carter, our Director of Regional Operations. Harold's been with Pinnacle for nearly 30 years. Her voice was casual, friendly, even. But there was no mistaking the implication. In this circle, everyone introduced themselves. Claire had assumed he and I were already acquainted. A strange silence settled as the others registered something unusual in her tone. She glanced between the two of us, then paused. "Wait, Carter?" she asked, blinking. "Are you two related?" My father hesitated. For the first time all morning, his voice wavered. "She's my daughter." The ripple was immediate. A few people visibly reacted, surprise breaking through their practiced executive facades. A couple exchanged glances, whispering quietly behind hands. One man's brows shot up before he smoothed his face back into neutral. Claire turned to him slowly. "Harold, I had no idea. You never mentioned your daughter was Colonel Carter. The Colonel Carter who's been overseeing our most critical military partnership. I wasn't aware of her current position." My father managed. "We hadn't discussed it." Claire looked between us with visible disbelief, but said nothing more. She shifted the conversation smoothly. "Well, I'm glad we're all connected now. Colonel, would you mind giving the team a brief overview of your operational role on Project Aegis? I think hearing it directly from you would help everyone understand the scope." "Of course," I nodded, grateful for the redirect. I stepped forward, activated the wall display, and walked them through the structure of the oversight process. Every approval checkpoint, every integration metric, every threshold for security compliance. I spoke with fluency born of field experience and thousands of hours under pressure. As I spoke, I saw the shift again. Not in the executives. They were already listening. but in my father. His eyes narrowed, not in skepticism, but in a dawning recognition. He looked at me like he was trying to reconcile two people, one he thought he knew, and one who now stood in front of his entire leadership team, commanding the room without apology. When I finished, Claire smiled with genuine admiration. As you can see, we're fortunate to have Colonel Carter's leadership on this project. Her expertise is unmatched, and her authority on these matters is absolute. There was applause, small, professional, but real. My father didn't clap. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. He had spent years describing my career as temporary, peripheral, a phase, and now, in the span of one morning, he was standing in a room full of people who were looking to me for direction, and somewhere, buried under the layers of pride and shock, I could see it. He was beginning to understand, not just who I was, but who I had been becoming all along. At precisely 11:00 a.m., I knocked once on the frosted glass door marked Director Harold Carter. Through the partition, I could already see them, my father behind his desk, Ethan standing near the window, and my mother, Lorraine, perched anxiously on the edge of a visitor chair, clutching her purse like it might anchor her. Someone must have called her after the meeting. Of course they had. Enter. My father called, his voice stripped of its usual command. I stepped in, uniform crisp, posture composed. The room fell silent. "Please, have a seat," he said, gesturing stiffly to the chair across from his desk. "Thank you," I replied, remaining on my feet, hands clasped at the small of my back. The stance was automatic, firm, respectful, unshakable. I had used it in briefings with generals. Today, it served me just as well. No one spoke at first. The air was thick with words unsaid. My mother finally broke the silence. "We didn't know," she said softly, "about any of it." "I know," I answered. "That's the point." My father leaned forward, elbows on the desk, brow furrowed. "Madison, why didn't you tell us all this time?" "I did," I said, my tone even. "I sent invitations, emails, updates when I was promoted. I left messages when my deployments were declassified. You just never asked." He blinked. My mother looked down. "You've spent years believing I was stuck." I continued, "As if I'd vanished into some obscure system you didn't understand, so you assumed it wasn't worth knowing." Ethan shifted. "You could have said something at dinner. Instead, you—" What I interrupted gently. Instead, I showed up and did my job. I met his eyes. "You mocked my career in front of everyone. Ethan, you called it a fallback. You said I'd still be taking orders in 10 years. And you didn't even flinch when you said it." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm not here to make you feel guilty," I said, turning back to my father. "This isn't about payback or humiliation. I've spent my entire adult life not asking for validation from this family. What I wanted, what I still want, is simple respect. Not applause, not admiration, just acknowledgement that the path I chose has value." My father exhaled, slowly. "It's just, I didn't know being a colonel meant that kind of authority, that kind of reach. It's equivalent to a vice president in your structure," I said quietly. "And I hold full oversight over Project Aegis, technical, budgetary, personnel. That includes Ethan's division." My mother looked visibly shaken. "We always thought you were smart," she said, almost pleading. "That's why it hurt so much when you didn't follow the plan. We just wanted what was best for you." "No," I corrected, gently but firmly. "You wanted what you understood to be best. And when I chose differently, you decided I'd failed, without ever asking why." Silence again. But not empty silence. This one held weight, thought, reflection. Ethan finally spoke. So, you outrank me. By a lot. This isn't a competition. Ethan. It always was. He muttered. Not just with you. With everything. They raised me to chase titles, to measure success by what could be framed or printed. I studied him for a moment. This wasn't sarcasm. It was realization, raw and uncomfortable. For what it's worth, he added, glancing at me. What you did in that meeting. I couldn't have done that. The way you commanded the room, the knowledge, the confidence. It was impressive. Coming from Ethan, that was more than an apology. It was a bridge. I nodded. Thank you. My father stood slowly, not defensive now, just unsure. So what do you want from us? Madison. An apology. Recognition. I want you to stop rewriting who I am to fit what you expected. I said, I want you to see me as I am. Nothing more. Nothing less. He walked around the desk, hesitated, then extended his hand. Colonel Carter, he said, voice low, unsteady. You've earned more than I ever gave you credit for. I was wrong. I see that now. I accepted his handshake, and for the first time, it wasn't out of obligation. It was because I finally believed he meant it. My father's handshake lingered a second longer than expected, not because he didn't know how to end it, but because something in him was still recalibrating. For years, he'd offered handshakes to clients, partners, and rising executives, but this one was to his daughter, and not as a courtesy, not as a gesture of family. This one carried the weight of respect. He cleared his throat and stepped back, as if unsure how to navigate what came next. My mother, still seated, looked down at her hands. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sleeve, something she used to do when we were children, usually when she couldn't find the right words without unraveling. We should have come, she said suddenly, her voice tight. To your ceremonies, the promotions. I would have liked to see you recognized. It was the closest thing to an apology I'd ever heard from her. Not rehearsed, not deflected, just real, simple, human. I would have liked that too, I replied softly. No bitterness, no sting, just truth. She nodded, then looked up at me, eyes a little glassier than before. I think we didn't come because we didn't understand what it meant. We thought the military was something temporary, a stopgap until you figured things out. I tilted my head, not in judgment, but in understanding. And when I didn't come back to the plan, you assumed I'd failed. She didn't deny it, but she didn't defend it either. Ethan, who had been silent since his earlier confession, finally pushed away from the window. His arms were still crossed, but his stance had shifted, less defiant, more contemplative. You know, he began. I used to think I was ahead of you, like I'd figured out how to win the game, the job, the title, the house, the recognition. He paused, searching for something deeper in his own thoughts. But today, watching you, I realized you weren't even playing the same game. You were doing something bigger, something I can't even wrap my head around. I said nothing. Let him continue. When I talked about user interface improvements, people nodded. But when you spoke, they listened. Not because you demanded it, because you earned it. I don't think I've ever seen a room shift like that. There was no resentment in his voice, just awe. The kind of awe that comes from finally seeing something clearly after years of misjudgment. You always seemed so distant, he added, like you didn't care about competing. I thought that meant you couldn't. Now I realize, you just didn't need to. That struck deeper than I expected. I stepped back slightly, letting my posture relax. My voice soften. It was never a race. Ethan, I wasn't trying to outrun anyone. I just needed to be where I belonged. He gave a small nod. I think I finally get that. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was space. Room for things to shift without force. Room for all of us to reconsider who we thought each other were. My father looked at me again, his expression more open now. Claire wants to have dinner with all of us tonight, he said, now that she knows. Now that she understands we're family. She was impressed, I know, I replied with a faint smile. He let out a quiet chuckle, something I hadn't heard from him in years. Of course, you do. You probably know more about this company's systems than I ever have. Only the classified parts, I said. And for the first time, we both laughed, genuinely, without the sharpness of old tension. For years, there had been walls, some inherited, some built in silence, and today, I wasn't tearing them down. But I could see the cracks, the first signs of light breaking through, and that was enough. For now. 6 months later, the sound of laughter echoed softly through my Arlington apartment. Not forced, not curated for politeness. Real, warm, familiar in a way that surprised me. The dining table, set for 5, sat beneath a brass pendant light that cast everything in soft gold. 2 candles flickered gently between the dishes, roasted vegetables, garlic bread, my mother's apple pie. The scent of cinnamon drifted through the air, curling around the quiet rhythm of conversation. My father was the first to arrive that evening, carrying a framed article in both hands. He handed it to me like something sacred. Saw this in the Washington Post, he said. Had it mounted for your office. It was the coverage from the Aegis launch. Me in uniform, standing beside General Holloway and Claire Montgomery. The headline clear: Youngest Colonel leads nation's most ambitious cyber defense project. Thank you, Dad, I said, taking it carefully. The gesture alone would have meant everything, but the fact that he had it framed, that meant he was proud. He nodded once, then looked around the apartment. Nice place. Organized. Sleek. Military precision. I joked. And to my surprise, he laughed. My mother arrived soon after, holding a foil-wrapped dish with the same cautious care she once reserved for formal occasions. She looked around, taking in the clean lines, the soft gray walls, the bookshelf filled with mission briefings and worn novels. It's lovely. Madison, she said, setting the pie down on the counter. So neat, so grounded. Her tone had changed, less assessing, more admiring. She asked questions now, not about where I'd been, but what I'd built. Questions that sought to understand, not compare. She didn't mention Ethan's house or Rachel's condo. She asked how long it took me to settle in, whether I liked the morning light in the second bedroom, whether the neighbors were kind. And then Ethan and Olivia arrived, carrying a bottle of wine far too expensive for a casual meal. Ethan handed it to me with a smile that no longer carried competition. Something new I'm trying, he said, pairing wine with success. I laughed and shook my head. You're still a show-off, and you're still a mystery, he replied, then added, but I'm working on it. Over dinner, he surprised me again. So, I implemented those security protocol suggestions you gave me last month, he said, reaching for the bread. The team thought I was a genius. I raised an eyebrow. Did you give credit where it was due? He grinned, sheepish. Eventually, after enjoying the applause for a solid 5 minutes, the table chuckled, my father included. But seriously, Ethan continued, we ran the simulations last week. Breach probability dropped by 30%. It's actually really solid work. Thank you, I said, and meant it. It wasn't the praise I cared about. It was the acknowledgement, the recognition that, for once, we were standing on the same ground, not as the golden child and the afterthought, but as professionals, equals. My father lingered near the bookshelf after dessert, his eyes drifting over the modest display of awards and challenge coins. He pointed to one in particular, a silver medallion from my unit's deployment in Estonia. "I read about that incident," he said quietly. "The intercepted breach attempt. That was yours, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Lives were at stake," he added. "I didn't understand it before. The work you do, it's not just impressive, it's critical." "It is," I replied. "Most people never see it. And that's the point." He nodded again, more slowly this time. From the living room, my mother called out, "Dinner was wonderful. Honey, thank you for hosting. You're always welcome here," I said. And I meant that, too, because something had shifted, not just in how they saw me, but in how they showed up. They came without performance, without pretense. They listened now. They asked. They stayed present. Ethan helped me clear plates while Olivia poured coffee. My mother hummed softly as she folded napkins. My father offered to take the trash out. Nothing dramatic, nothing monumental. Just the quiet signs of something being rebuilt. Something real. A family, not defined by roles or expectations, but finally, by choice. The doorbell rang just after sunset, right as the final touches of dinner were coming together. Roasted chicken resting on the counter, wine breathing in tall crystal glasses, and the table set for 6, this time with one extra seat that meant more than anyone else knew. I opened the door to find Brigadier General Dana Holloway standing tall, composed as ever in civilian attire, though the presence she carried was unmistakable. She smiled as I stepped aside to let her in. "Colonel Carter," she said, with just the right amount of warmth and formality. "General," I returned, then softened. "Dana, thank you for coming." "Wouldn't have missed it," she replied, glancing around. "It's not every day I get to meet the people who shaped the woman you became." Inside, the atmosphere was different than it had been 6 months ago. There was no tension, no awkward recalibration, only anticipation, and maybe a hint of reverence. My mother stood from the sofa immediately. "General Holloway, welcome," she said with a nervous smile. "We've heard so much about you." "Likewise," Dana said, shaking her hand firmly. "Your daughter's spoken highly of her upbringing. Discipline, precision. I can see where it came from." My father approached next, extending his hand with the same respect he once reserved only for CEOs and senior partners. "General, it's an honor. I understand we have you to thank for seeing Madison's potential before anyone else did." Dana didn't hesitate. The potential was always there. "Mr. Carter, I simply gave her the opportunities she'd already earned." We sat for dinner, and unlike every other family meal before, this time, the conversation centered around me, and not once did it feel uncomfortable. Dana spoke of my early work in the task force, the Estonia breach that nearly slipped through NATO's radar, the protocol I'd helped design that now formed the backbone of our defensive infrastructure. My family listened, not passively, not politely, but intently. There was no redirecting the topic, no dismissive silence, just respect, pure and unfiltered. At one point, over dessert, my father lifted his glass, the candlelight flickering against its rim. "To Colonel Madison Carter," he said clearly, his voice carrying with quiet strength, "who proved that the path less expected can lead to the most extraordinary places. We may not have seen it early, but we couldn't be prouder now." Everyone raised their glass. Even Ethan. Especially Ethan. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I had something to prove. I didn't need to fight for space at this table. I didn't need to remind them of who I was. They saw it. They saw me. Not as the daughter who'd strayed, Not as the sister who'd fallen out of step, but as the woman I'd always been becoming, on my own terms. Colonel, leader, equal. And that was the real victory, not the applause, not the title, but finally being seen completely. And as the last candle flickered low and the table quieted, I realized something simple but undeniable. This was never about proving them wrong. It was about becoming who I was meant to be, whether they noticed or not. They see it now, and that matters. But even when they didn't, I still became her. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to walk your own path without applause, leave a comment below and tell me what kept you going. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories about quiet strength, earned respect, and the power of showing up anyway.